Prema Repana Samoda Tvaye maranurmi nasam tasmat tvameva sharanam mama dina krityam karoti kalusam guhakanto kare shantam shivam subimalam tava nama natham yasmadaham tvasharana jagadeka gamya tvameva sharanam mama dina bandha om sapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma swarupine avatar varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha Om Namah Sri Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya Namo Namaha Om Namah Sri Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya Namo Namaha Om Namah Sri Bhagavate Ramakrishnaya Namo Namaha. Om Sarvamangala Mangale Shive Sarvartha Sadhike Sharanye Trambake Gauri Narayani Namostute Srishti Sthiti Vinashana Shakti Bhute जय महामाई की जय, जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय, जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Hello, check. Namashri Atirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swami Netapaharine. So we were discussing this last one of the 3 Maya lectures of Vivekananda from Jnana-Yoga. And we were looking at these various illustrations of Maya that he had given, concluding with this incident from one of these Puranic stories where Narada asks Krishna to show him what his Maya is about. And then he goes to fetch some water, and then there's a whole life story that spans out, and then his wife and children are swept away by the floods. And in his mind, 12 years have gone by, and when he is thrown on the banks of the river that is in Spate, he hears from behind him a gentle voice, "My child, where is the water? You went to fetch a pitcher of water, and I am waiting for you. You have been gone for quite half an hour." "Half an hour," Narada exclaimed. 12 whole years had passed through his mind, and all these scenes had happened in half an hour. And he concludes with, "And this is Maya." See, this is a slightly different instance from the instances of contradiction that define the human condition that we had discussed before. Here, the point that he is emphasizing, Vivekananda is emphasizing, is that time has passed by. 12 years have gone through our mind, whereas according to another person, only half an hour. In any absolute terms, only half an hour has gone by. And he says this is another aspect of the foundation of contradictions that define our life. Which means that our subjective notion of the world and another's subjective notion of the world can often be at variance with each other. And this defines the richness of the fabric of life, at the same time its sorrows and joys. This is a kind of experience that we daily undergo. When we go to sleep and are in dream, what happens? There's a period of time which gets stretched very often, and it looks to us as if a substantial period of time is going by. And when we wake up, we realize that no, it's not that substantial period of time that has gone by, but a rather short period. Again, it means that time in the mind and time as measured objectively in our waking state are different things. So, even something which in our waking state we tend to regard as something rather fundamental, namely time, it appears to us to be stretched once we close our eyes and go to sleep. In the Vedanta literature, it's said that the experience of deep sleep, when there are no waves in the mind, so to speak, is the experiencer, namely the person who's sleeping, cannot say anything of that state. He wakes up and says, "Sukham aham aswapsam na kinchit avedisham." That means I slept happily. Sukham aswapsam. That means I slept happily. Na kinchit. Not a bit. Avedisham. Did I know? So I knew nothing. Nothingness is only the object of experience. I knew nothing. Now, this particular point, when we try to grasp intellectually, it gives rise to two philosophies which are sort of mirror images of each other. On the one hand, Advaita Vedanta, on the other hand, Madhyamaka Buddhism, where, one calls the reality, the supreme reality, so to speak. I'll have to expand on that expression a little later, but the supreme reality in the Madhyamaka philosophy is called Shunya. In this, it's called Brahman or everything. Essentially, the difference lies whether it depends on what is your starting premise. The Buddhists basically start from, they are empiricists. Yeah, so they start with the assumption, the hypothesis, that this that we see around us, this world, is real. And within this, they look for where this word real is really rests. Yeah? And when they start analyzing this notion of reality and analyze their entire experience, Panchaskandha is what they call it. This five aggregates. So when they start analyzing these aggregates means the physical world around us, including the physical body, then our mind, our emotions, our sensations, our individual consciousnesses. So basically consciousness or awareness of, say, this chair, this table, etc., etc. And once they start analyzing it, they come to the conclusion that there is no permanent substance in any of it. This is their conclusion. Why? Because they start with this hypothesis that as a starting point, this empirical experience is what we grasp to be true. And the conclusion is that there is no lasting or substantial truths in any of this experience. This is one point of view. The same point of view reflected is essentially one starts with the experiencer, which means a more idealistic position. It's basically the mirror image. In an experience, there is the experiencer and the experienced. Yeah? The Buddhists start analyzing the experienced by saying that this is all that an experience consists of. The Advaita Vedantin starts from the point of view of the experiencer and starts doing the same analysis. In practice, in terms of practice, actual practice, this practice called Viveka or analysis, Shankara has this little booklet called the Drigdrishya Viveka. What one does is analyzes away from this notion of the experiencer all that is not the experiencer, and comes to the conclusion that this experiencer is the same as the reality underlying the world. It essentially says that there is something real underlying the world because we do not ever mistrust the reality of the experiencer. And they come to the conclusion of one of these Mahavakyas, Aham Brahmasmi. One of my friends, Swami Sarvapriyanji, who many of you might know, once told me this, that there was some particular shloka from the Mandukya Karika, which is written by Shankara's guru's guru, Shankara's teacher's teacher, Gaudapada, which says, this is something that I've read, and he told me the mirror image of that in one of the, coming from the Buddhist literature. So the one from the Mandukya Karika says Tattvam adhyatmikam drishtva, tattvam drishtva tu bahyatah, tatvibhutah tada ramah, tattvat aprachyuto bhavet. Tattvam. Tat means that reality. Tvam means you. That means the reality in me and the reality in the world, that oneness, that identity. Tattvam adhyatmikam. That means in the mental or idealistic sense. Having sensed that identity at an idealistic sense, tattvam drishtva tu bahyatah, and having sensed that identity in terms of our external experience, what happens? Tatvi bhutaha. One becomes identified with that reality. This individual empirical I loses its fictional or fictitious moorings in the body and mind and becomes identified with the reality that underlies the world of experience. And after that, what? Tattvat aprachyuto bhavet. Having gotten to that conclusion, don't allow yourself to be deviated from it. So it's both an understanding, an insight, as well as a practice. Now we look to the Buddhist literature to look at the mirror image of exactly this. It says, Shunyam adhyatmikam drishtva, Shunyam drishtva tu bahyatah, Shunyi bhutah tadarama, Shunyat aprachyuto bhavet. Same expression replacing tattva by shunya. What does it mean? It means that seeing the insubstantiality of what we usually regard as our internal experience. And then one goes on and comes to the conclusion. So, on the one hand, these seem to be mirror images of each other. On the other, they seem to be antipodes. One is saying everything. The essence of my existence is everything. The other is saying the existence of my essence is nothing. If you boil it down to the logical antipodes between which our mind fluctuates, what happens? It's a fluctuation between affirmation and negation. Yes and no. And we as human beings are accustomed to thinking in terms of this two-valued logic. The Buddhists, on the other hand, used a four-valued logic. So neither true nor untrue, both true and untrue, and certainly true, untrue. Yeah? This is their four-valued logic that they went through. Anyway, so the thing is, in terms of this two-valued logic, there is the yes and the no. Where lies the reconciliation? And why are we saying that these two are really mirror images of each other? First, in terms of actual practice, in terms of actually getting to a point where such an insight can be ours, there really is no difference. The philosophical underpinnings, the philosophical infrastructure that is there in the mind might be different. But in terms of what one is actually doing, no difference. It's basically this discrimination or analysis to see that what we regard as intrinsic to ourselves has deeper and deeper layers, which if you move further and further inside, those fall away. Sri Ramakrishna describes this by an analogy. It's if you take the onion and you start peeling it, you get to nothing. Yeah? So there is no substance once you have peeled that onion off. So there is a corresponding point of view that, look, there is no substance really that you're hunting for. It's this composite, this bunch of layers put together that constitutes the onion. But if you ask, where is the onionness of the onion, and you start peeling layers to get at the core, you end up in nothing. So Vedanta also essentially says the same thing when it says that it is this conflation of antipodes that defines our empirical experience. But the instinct, the desire, the deeper aspiration to hunt for reality in the midst of all these contradictions, to get at truths, to get at knowledge in the midst of all these contradictions, is also a defining characteristic of human beings. It's called jigyasa. Yeah? As I've said before, jigyasa is usually translated as enquiry, but it's in Sanskrit it comes from this expression gya, from this dhatu gya, desire to know. That is what real jigyasa is about. So that's also one of the defining properties of human beings. So if one takes that desire to know the truth above everything else as that which guides our lives, then it's going to remove these layers one by one and arrive at either the conclusion that there is no substantial reality behind any of this, an expression which is what is described as shunyatva, or say basically that the substance behind, the reality behind all of phenomenal existence and the substance behind my existence are the same. Essentially, it's in that sense that the Buddhist view, the Madhyamaka Buddhist view, and this Advaita Vedanta view are the same. The reconciliation has actually been done in two ways. First, in terms of the practice. And this, I'll like to quote the Leela Prasanga, or the Great Master, by Swami Saradananda, where he raises the question that Sri Ramakrishna practiced all these major world religions and came to the conclusion that all of them point to the same truth, the same reality. And then he asks, why then did he not practice personally Buddhism? I mean, that's the major world religion, but we do not find anywhere in the literature Sri Ramakrishna practicing this Madhyamaka Buddhism or Buddhism per se. And then, as an answer to that, Sharadanji answers by saying that he used to say, Ramakrishna used to say, that this Vedanta, the Jnana, the path of Jnana, the Jnana Marga spoken of in Vedanta, and the path that the Buddha preached, they are the same. So in terms of practice, as paths, these two are really the same. This is identity at the level of practice. Philosophically, or epistemologically, or say even, at some level ontologically, he says in a different place, now from the Gospel, from the Kathamrita, Osti nasti prakritir khala, or mayar khala. Yes and no are the play of nature. Reality, as we know, as we want to seek it, want to understand it, want to grasp it, transcends this, transcends these dualities of yes and no. This is the final abstraction that we are talking about. So far, we were discussing experiential contradictions, joy versus woe, satisfaction versus dissatisfaction, timelessness versus things which are momentary. Here we are looking at the structure underlying these contradictions, what generalizes all these contradictions. And finally it boils down to yes versus no. And it is here in Buddhism, in Madhyamika Buddhism and in Advaita Vedanta, one gets to this point where one says that both yes and no are aspects of the same reality, or the reality we are seeking transcends this duality of yes and no. It's a rather lofty idea. It basically says that it does not make sense to say that the supreme reality is, just as much as it does not make sense to say that the supreme reality is not. And if you want to remove this word supreme, so be it. It says that it does not make sense to say reality is, it does not make sense to say reality is not. Why? Because these concepts, is and is not, are aspects of the mind playing its own games. It's the foundation on which all these antipodes are built. And it is these contradictions that define Maya. Returning to this place, what does Vivekananda say? He basically illustrates this particular contradiction by asking questions about one of the foundational structures that define our day-to-day experience, namely time. Timelessness versus something that lasts for a short time. What is the contradiction? Something that lasts for a short time versus something that lasts for a long time. And he says that there is no absolute there either. Because in our minds, time could have gone on for 12 years. In another's mind, it is only for half an hour. Some of you might have heard of this paradox, the twin paradox. This is something that's now actually a scientific fact. It's a consequence of what's called the general theory of relativity of Einstein. So if you have an individual, say think of two twins, one on Earth, the other takes off on a rocket and travels for a long time, and then returns after a while in an accelerated vehicle. Then by the time he returns, his subjective sense of time would be such that he would return to the earth and be contemporaneous essentially with his or her grandchildren. See, so this statement about even our subjective notions of time differing has an objective counterpart. Even in the hardest of sciences, it's a fact that if you do travel in a it has to be, you have to travel really very fast for that. But it's a fact that as far as the laws of physics are concerned, they will tell you that when you come back to Earth, you will come back and meet your grandchildren and think of them as somebody who has the same age as you. Which means your subjective clock has slowed. Yeah? So what looks like it's the opposite of this particular phenomenon. What looks like me to be 2 years turns out to be actually 80 years or maybe 100 years in the frame of reference of the Earth. Here he is talking about the opposite phenomenon. It's 12 years in the mind of Narada and a few months, half an hour in the mind of somebody else. So this contradiction, it basically says, what's the upshot of all this? It essentially says that we tend to go through life without inquiring about its foundations. Where lie the foundations of my existence? Where lies the substantiality of my experience? Where is the reality that I ascribe to myself, that I ascribe to the world around me every moment of my existence. And then proceeds from there to ask questions of it, not with some idle curiosity, but as something that drives one above everything else. This craving for truth, a deep-seated longing in the human heart, can only be satisfied when this process of enquiry is carried on to the hilt, to its conclusion. And he says, I'll just read out the next paragraph, and we'll start with this paragraph next time. So far, we were looking at these, basically coming to the gist, to the abstract. In a certain sense, these are very abstract realities, but till they become real to us, we will not gain these insights. He is trying to explain, he started off explaining Maya as a kind of experiential fact that comprises these various contradictions. Now he is coming and questioning one aspect of the foundations of our existence, namely the structure of time, and showing how that itself, which we take for granted, is itself relative. And now he's probably, after having given all these illustrations, he is going to try to get at a certain attitude by which we can handle these contradictions in terms of practice. But what is the conclusion? In answer, he says, in one form or another, we are all in it. It is the most difficult and intricate state of things to understand. It has been preached in every country, taught everywhere, but only believed in by a few. Because until we get the experiences ourselves, we cannot believe in it. What does it show? Something very terrible, for it is all futile. Time, the avenger of everything, comes and nothing is left. He swallows up the saint and the sinner, the king and the peasant, the beautiful and the ugly. He leaves nothing. Everything is rushing towards that one goal, destruction. Our knowledge, our arts, our sciences, everything is rushing towards it. None can stem the tide. None can hold it back for a minute. We may try to forget it in the same way that persons in a plague-stricken city try to create oblivion by drinking, dancing, and other vain attempts, and so becoming paralyzed. So we are trying to forget, trying to create oblivion by all sorts of sense pleasures, and this is Maya. We've nearly come to the end of the time for today. There is another booklet by a king called Bhartrihari called Vairagya Shatakam. Vairagya Shatakam. 100 verses on dispassion or renunciation. And there is, in one little verse, he has sort of epitomized or sort of condensed this aspect of human existence. There is this person hanging. So there's this long venomous snake with its tail wound around and its head hanging down. And there's this person which was about to fall off a cliff and has caught hold of that snake's neck and is hanging from that. Below him stretches this crevice. If he lets go of that snake, he'll fall into the crevice and be killed. If he loosens the hold slightly, the snake will bite him and he'll die. In this setup, he sees a little bush which is within hand's reach from him, and it has grown some berries. And he stretches out his arm, his other arm, to pluck one of those berries and tastes it, and it is sweet. And he says, the pleasures of our life are like that, fleeting, where we are surrounded essentially by our mortality, and we forget that mortality every moment. It's inbuilt into our system. If we were not able to ignore mortality, this phenomenal life that we know it would just not continue. But it is as temporal as that. This understanding, not intellectual, but something felt as a deep reality, is what is called dispassion vairagya. And this particular paragraph of Vivekananda really emphasizes that. We'll come back to it next time. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.